Awesome. Welcome to the Women's March Canada podcast, making the equality of women in Canada the new norm. I'm your host, Melissa Durrell, inspiring, uniting, and leading the charge for the advancement of women across Canada. Please give a warm welcome to our guest this week, Paulina Cameron. And Paulina, you have had me just turning pages. Get that in one sec. So, because we got to set you up. Paulina is the business development manager at Futurpreneur Canada in BC and in Yukon, which is a national nonprofit organization, which I can't wait to hear more about, fueling youth entrepreneurship by providing financing, mentorship, and supporting tools for aspiring business owners. Very cool. She's also the chair of the board of directors at Young Women in Business and has received her chartered accountant designation. She recently added author to her long list of impressive credentials with her book, Canada, 150 Women Conversations with Leaders, Champions, and Luminaries. I'm really excited to hear more about this book, but first, welcome to our show.
Thank you, Melissa. So happy to be here.
So obviously it was Canada's 150th birthday. Is that what inspired you? And tell me a bit about this book and the journey.
Yeah, that was part of it. So I've been collecting women's stories for decades. So I started Young Women in Business and ran it for a number of years back in 2008, so a decade ago this year, which is a fun full circle for me. And at the time, we started it with the conference because we were attending so many events in the community where you had maybe one token female speaker as part of the list. And I don't know about you, but whenever I see a conference come out or awards come out, I have this habit, this like almost tick where I start counting up. I can't even help it. And so we started it by running a conference where every single speaker was a woman. Is a 3-day, 350-person conference, and it was awesome. And then it continued growing into this amazing organization. But I've been collecting women's stories since then, and I've seen the power that stories can have in both inspiring us and also shaping and changing the narrative of what we imagine and see possible of someone in a position of leadership or power of influence. And I've seen how that can change for me. I've seen how it changes when someone can have for the first time a female role model or mentor, or a young girl who has not heard of a female astronaut or entrepreneur or CEO. You know, to this day, if you go to Google, and if you were to Google in this moment right now, CEO, there would be a very homogenous list of images that would pop up to you. So not a lot has changed, and not a lot has changed at the same time. And I think particularly women, and this is very particularly true, I think, of Canadian women, is we're very humble and we're not very comfortable tooting our own horns. And yet there is so much to celebrate and be proud of and to talk about. And so this is a bit of my ode and gift to us all.
Very cool. So how did you start? So you've been collecting them, or did you actually do 150 interviews?
Yeah, good point. So the idea for the book I had in March of last year, so a year ago, and then the book came out in the fall, which I don't recommend for anyone's sanity, particularly if you also have a demanding full-time job and a 2-year-old. But it was, you know, a timely idea, and I wanted it to exist and to happen. And so here we are. So these stories are actually not ones that I've been collecting per se for the last decade. These are all stories that I had the opportunity to interview these women over the last few months of the last year. So I started, of course, the first place was identifying the women. So at some point I had an Excel list of like 1,800 incredible women. And, you know, truthfully, there could probably be 150 books of 150 women. There are so many incredible stories that I was able to experience and hear about during this period of time. So the first place was identifying the women, reaching out, some of them totally cold calling. And, you know, some are names that we know and are familiar with, like Kim Campbell or Payette or Hayley Wickenheiser. But there are also names of women whose stories and names aren't as well known yet, that are really pillars in their community, and they're doing really, really significant work and have stories that are really impactful.
Yeah, tell me about some of them. And I mean, what was it like tell me some of the stories about meeting these women. Was it all done on the phone, or did you actually go and have coffee with some of them?
Yeah, it was a mix. So I spent some time obviously here in BC. I went out to Ontario and out east and met some of the women, and it was a combination of all the things. Some people prefer to prefer to talk through things. Some people prefer to write. So sometimes I'd chat with someone over the phone and then they submit their stories in written response and I'd follow up over the phone and then we'd kind of curate how it would appear in the book. It was a really wonderful experience and I was so touched by the women who really chose to be very open and vulnerable through their stories. So there's two women in particular that chose for the first time ever to share stories of surviving intimate partner abuse for the first time in such a public way. And they did it because, you know, they're very successful, very accomplished, known women, and they have this other story in their life that has equally taught them a lot and is very much part of their narrative. And they knew how empowering that would be for someone else to read if they were ever in that same circumstance. So I was really, really honored with their courage to do that.
What did you learn about yourself as you were meeting all of these women?
Oh, that is such a good question. I just learned how much I love women and their stories. It was a good reminder of that. I always walked away so energized. And, you know, a common thing, two things that were really common that a lot of women shared were the power of relationships with people that they built and a reminder of how important that is. And then two, that one of the questions that I asked a lot of women is, what was a moment of courage or something that you really, you know, had to step into in a significant moment for you in your life? And they talked about how transforming that was and how much learning they got from those experiences. So also a feeling of encouragement in those moments.
Yeah, isn't that great? I always think that's one of the keys to success, I think, for women, not just in Canada, but around the globe, is to really lean on each other.
Yes.
Start to form networks that, you know, men have had for centuries, essentially. And we really need to form those kind of bonds if we're going to make if we're going to make equality or ever, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So political process is definitely a place where we need to see some of those equality numbers happen. What are some of the things that you're doing to see that happen?
One thing that I've been really interested in seeing happen is obviously what we see happen with the government of Canada. So we've seen a lot of shifts happening over the last few years, and some people think they're enough. Other people say that they're not enough, and there still needs to be and certainly there's so much to do. What I find exciting is that there's new precedents that seem to be continually set. So when we had a gender balanced cabinet, that was a new precedent that was set, right? Like, I think it will be really hard to go back to something different. Or with the latest budget that we had, where the word women was mentioned like 700 or 800 times, and previously it was like 60. That's a new precedent that we have to go forward, which to me is really exciting.
Yeah. Now, I know one of the things that, one of the questions that we were looking at around, I guess, entrepreneurship and women starting businesses. And, you know, you said if you Google CEO, it's all male images that come up. And one of the things we had here was of the companies that raised over $50 million in the last 7 years, 0 were female-led businesses. So, I mean, obviously there's some major spaces that we need to gain some momentum in. How do you see us doing that?
So it's a really good question. You mentioned where my day job is before, so Futurepreneur Canada. And just to note, I'm actually the regional director for BC, Alberta and Yukon. And it's a really interesting space. So we support really early stage entrepreneurs. So we work with entrepreneurs that are under 40 years old that are starting a business for the very first time. We're usually the first source of external funding. And I'm really proud that BC is the province that supports the most percentage of female entrepreneurs. And we've been able to do that through a lot of collaborative partnerships with other organizations that work in this space. And yet, despite of that, we still know that while women are starting businesses at similar rates that men are, they aren't growing at the same pace and aren't accessing the same amount of capital and resources to be able to scale. I'm involved with the local initiative called the Raise Collective, which is working on supporting closing that gap by specifically working with women who are going through to their first raise. So where we see a lot of women not accessing as much is when they're going through kind of $250K to $1 million, that initial stage. There's some support that the government is channeling towards that through the Business Development Bank of Canada through the latest budget that came out. But we know that for women, it's more than just money. Right? They want to be, and they need more support on the mentor and champion side, because as you said, earlier, they don't have the same networks that have been around for a while, and they don't know how to navigate them in the same way. And they often face a lot of no's and a lot of hitting their head on the wall from the get-go that can feel really discouraging and disappointing. We know women will more frequently ask for less money or approach a pitch differently, but also their pitches are received differently. So I read a really interesting article, I think it was by Harvard Business Review about a week or two ago it came out, that talked about women who pitch impact-based businesses are received more generously and are given more money than women who pitch purely financially driven businesses than men. With the difference being that we have an expectation of warmth versus strength from women. So we expect women to fall more into the do-good, warmth, impact category, versus we expect men to typically be pitching more financially driven businesses. And so when we hear and receive pitches from women that fall into the other category, our expectations come at a clash to what we're hearing, and it does a disservice to men. So it's really interesting when we think about how women go out and get funding and how they fundraise and who they're talking to and how to navigate that piece.
So I read that same article.
Yeah. What did you think?
It was interesting. And the one thing that I kept thinking of is, they're pitching to a room full of men. So these are actually the men that they're saying, you know, we are more likely to fund women that have that impact, the impactful statement. Whereas if you had a room full of women that were funding it, which I actually think that's part of the direction we need to do. Yeah. We need to be working on. We're putting so much effort into female CEOs growing their companies, but we also need to be putting a ton of effort into women with higher salaries to give back into that.
Yes.
We're likely to help fund and mentor these young CEOs too, right?
That's exactly it. So changing who the investors are. So in Canada, less than 12% of investors are women. Yes. And women typically won't self-identify as investors even when they are. Yeah. But it's funny because there are now platforms that enable us to do this. So 3 of the companies that we're working with through the Raise Collective are fundraising on a platform called Front Funder, which allows non-accredited investors, so regular people like me and you, to invest from amounts of $250.
Okay.
And actually invest in equity. So the way the platform works is similar to something like Kickstarter, which a lot of people are familiar with, where you put money down and then in Kickstarter you get a product back, but here you become an investor and you own a percentage of the company. And so that is a very, very tangible way that we can activate our capital in even small amounts and walk the talk with our values.
Yeah, right on. I think that's great. So it's Front Funder?
Yeah. And if you go to the Raise Collective, we're announcing next week, I believe, all of the companies that will be raising through it. We have 7 incredible ones that are going through the first cohort, 3 of whom are raising. And we have a really fun campaign that we'll be launching around that next week.
Oh, very cool. Okay, so I'll get the digits from you so that we can promote it on Canada. Yeah. So, one of the things I wanted to ask you are, what are some of the things that we should be watching for? So,
that's one for sure to come. There'll be a fun, a month-long countdown for a very specific number of dollars that these companies are raising. So that'll be awesome. The thing that I always like to also tell people is to consider how they can every day change and shift how they think about things, like tangible actions. I find that a lot of people get a little bit disenchanted when they hear some of these statistics or hear about this, because it feels like a lot of it is beyond their own influence or impact or what they're able to do. So I like to say there are very tangible things where you can walk the talk in terms of your values and what you can do. As simple as redirecting some of your investing money. But another thing I always say is you can buy from women. You can find out where women-owned businesses are. Toronto actually has an awesome initiative. I found it on Instagram. I think it's called City of Women, that is mapping out businesses run by women in the city of Toronto. I'm talking to the team and then here in Vancouver, because I'd love to have a replica here. But for anyone in BC based, if you need companies run by women, I have lists for you. If you need to find them, we can activate that way. Something I did last year, and this was a friend had asked me, was I looked at all of the books I read last year. I got very dorky and I did an audit of all of the books that I read. And I looked at how many of them were written by women.
Yes.
And it was a lot lower than I wanted.
Really?
And so now I'm very conscious of making sure that I'm reading at least 75% books written by women this year. It was really low. It was only like 20% books that I'd read over the last year were by women. Yeah. And totally it wasn't something that I had a lens or layer around. Like I just wasn't conscious or intentional around it, which I find it happens for a lot of us, right? Like life is busy. We're all trying to do our best, but where I find we can often make a lot of impact is when we start thinking about these small actions in a really intentional way.
And I'm just thinking, you probably read a lot of business books, right?
Yes.
And
yes.
so, and I do too. And I do find the majority of them are written by men. And so the choices are limited.
They are, and you can dig a bit more and find them. I think it's the first immediate visible choices, right? It takes a little bit more digging for sure.
And now you're going to be one of those people in the books. Are you going to do another one? Do you think?
I don't know. I don't think I'll do another one quite like this. Although, like I said, there are so many stories, and I think there is never a shortage of them. One of my favorite stories about someone who has this book was a teacher in Winnipeg, and she wrote me an email to say that for her grade 5 and 6 history and social studies classes, she pulled all the textbooks from them and is using this book instead for the textbook because, to quote her, she said, "I don't need my kids learning about more men starting wars. I want them to learn about the leaders who are shaping our country going forward," which I loved. How incredible is that, right? Yeah, so there's a classroom in Winnipeg, somewhere out there in Winnipeg, that is just going to be magical.
Whenever I hear cool stuff going on, it's Winnipeg. I'm like, that's a pretty cool city. That's amazing to hear. My daughter is in grade 5, and I definitely want to share this book with her. We were reading, there's that Rebel Girls book.
Oh, I love that book. Yeah.
Which is super fun too.
Totally.
But you know what? Reading about Canadian women is so important. And I loved what you said earlier about how we're humble and we're not really promoting ourselves. I was listening to the radio the other day and someone was talking about Kim Campbell and how she wasn't really the first female prime minister. And I always think, come on now, no one discounts, I guess,
any other prime minister that was there for a short period of time. Yeah.
Why are we so quick to do that? And I think
totally.
I just think we do need to shift our culture. And I think it's starting to happen. Do you feel that this year has been, or the last maybe year and a half, there's been a real difference?
There's been a lot of noise. It's been loud and it's been louder. I think it takes a bit of time to see what the effects of that and the impact will be. My kind of go-to measurement is I'm always very curious of what's happening at high school and elementary levels. Something that I've observed, and I heard this from a lot of the women in the book, who are particularly the ones over the age of, say, 50, 60, is they said that they couldn't believe that we're still where we are in terms of gender equality. They thought by now, and by the amount of time and by the amount of movements and action that had happened, we would be a lot further. Kristen Cochrane shared in the book that she was really reinvigorated when she attended the marches last year. And she saw women in their 70s and 80s holding signs that said, "I can't believe I'm still marching for this shit." Right. But it made me think about how often, particularly young women who haven't yet experienced any kind of barriers or been engaged in this dialogue in a very active way, their perception is that things are going well, there's been improvements, there is no glass ceiling, we're doing well. And in some sense, that optimism is helpful. Otherwise, there are a lot of things that are depressing around some of the stats and data that we have. But the challenge that I find with that is, because you're not aware of it, it also means you're probably not actively working on it and engaged with it and making sure that it's an agenda item that is being strongly pushed forward and worked on. And that slows down then the trajectory and of how quickly things move. So that's one area where I get a little bit weary around.
Yeah, you're right. We got to keep it on the agenda. And amazing women like you are doing that.
And you as well.
No. But I will say, I mean, how can people find out more about you? And can you give us some Twitter, some Facebook?
Yeah, I'm all over all the social things. Paulina Cameron with 2 A's. So Paulina A. Cameron is where you will find me everywhere.
Amazing. Well, we'll definitely put that on our social channels too. Paulina, you're a rock star. I so enjoyed chatting with you, and I'm going to absolutely connect with you after we get off.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Melissa.
Take care.
Bye.
So big thank you to our guest, Paulina, and thanks to everyone who tuned in to listen. Your comments are always welcome and encouraged. Please subscribe to the Women's March Canada podcast channel and receive updates every time we upload a new one, which is about once every week. Our mission across Canada is to stand together in solidarity with our partners and children for the protection of our rights, our safety, our health, and our families, recognizing that our vibrant and diverse communities are the strength of our country. This is the Women's March Canada podcast. You can find us on Twitter at Women's March CBA and our website, womensmarchcanada.com. I'm Melissa Durrell. Have a great day. And we are out.
Awesome.
So great.